My name's Janet, and I've got a story to tell you. I've been married for 30 years now, but let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up with a dad who knew how to make things happen. He ran his own factory, building affordable homes for folks who needed them. When I met Tom, I thought I'd found my happily ever after. We got married young, and my dad, being the generous guy he was, gave us a house as a wedding gift. 2 years into our marriage, I had my son, Jake. I threw myself into being a mom, giving Jake all the love and attention I could. One day, when Jake was about 3, I brought up the idea of going back to work. Tom wasn't having it. "Janet, we've talked about this," he said, not even looking up from his newspaper. "Jake needs you here. Your job is to take care of our son and keep this house running." That's what we agreed on, remember? I didn't remember agreeing to that, but I nodded anyway. It wasn't worth the fight. As the years went by, Tom grew more and more frustrated with his job. He was a sales manager, but he wanted more. One night, he came home in a foul mood, slamming doors and muttering under his breath. "What's wrong?" I asked, following him into the kitchen. He whirled around, his face red with anger. "What's wrong? I'll tell you what's wrong. I've been busting my ass at that company for years, and they passed me over for promotion again. Some young hotshot got it instead." I tried to comfort him, but he brushed me off. Then, his eyes lit up with an idea. "Your dad," he said, grabbing my shoulders. "Your dad could give me a job. A good one. You could talk to him, couldn't you?" I hesitated. My dad had always kept his business and family separate. But the look in Tom's eyes, I couldn't say no. "I'll talk to him," I promised. And I did. It took some convincing, but Dad agreed to give Tom a chance. I thought it would solve all our problems. Boy, was I wrong. Things were good for a while. Tom was making good money, and he seemed happier. But my life was poisoned by Tom's mother, Martha. The first time she showed up unannounced, I was elbow-deep in laundry. The doorbell rang, and there she was, all fake smiles and judgmental eyes. "Janet, dear," she cooed, pushing past me into the house. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. "You don't mind, do you?" Before I could answer, she was in the living room, running a finger along the coffee table and skiing at the dust. "Oh my," she said, shaking her head. "You really should keep things cleaner, dear. My Tommy deserves better than this." I gritted my teeth and forced a smile. "I was just about to clean, actually. Can I get you something to drink?" She waved her hand dismissively. No, I'll make my own tea. You get back to your, whatever it is you do all day." That was just the beginning. Martha became a regular fixture in our lives, always dropping by unannounced, always criticizing. I tried talking to Tom about it, but he always took her side. Life went on like that for a while. I'd wake up, get Jake ready for school, clean the house, cook meals, and deal with Martha's surprise visits. Then came the night that changed everything. Tom burst through the door, his face twisted with rage. I was in the kitchen, fixing dinner, and nearly dropped the plate I was holding. "Tom, what's wrong?" I asked, setting the plate down carefully. He stormed into the kitchen, slamming his briefcase on the counter. "Your father," he spat, "is a tyrant and a despot. He humiliates people and uses them like they're nothing." I was shocked. My dad had always been kind and fair, at least as far as I knew. "What are you talking about? What happened?" Tom paced the kitchen, his hands clenched into fists. "I stood up for an employee today. Someone your father was treating unfairly. And you know what he did? He fired me. Just like that." My mind was reeling. This didn't sound like my dad at all. There must be some mistake. "Let me talk to him, I'm sure we can sort this out." "No," Tom roared, making me flinch. "You're not talking to him. You're not talking to any of them ever again. As far as we're concerned, your parents don't exist anymore. Do you understand me?" I nodded mutely, too stunned to argue. Tom had never spoken to me like this before, and it scared me. From that day on, our lives changed dramatically. Tom found another job and started earning well again, but he was different. Colder, more controlling. He forbade me from contacting my parents, and even Jake wasn't allowed to see his grandparents anymore. Years passed. Jake grew up, a quiet, thoughtful boy who seemed to sense the tension in our home. When he got accepted to a college in another city, I was both proud and heartbroken. Proud of my son's achievements, but devastated to lose the one person who made my life bearable. After Jake left, things got worse. Tom and Martha became more demanding, more belittling. They treated me like a servant, constantly criticizing and ordering me around. One afternoon, Martha barged in as usual. "Janet," she barked, "I need you to take me shopping. And then you're going to cook dinner for me and my friends. We're having a little get-together tonight." I was exhausted, having spent the morning scrubbing the house from top to bottom. "Martha, I'm really tired. Can we do this another day?" She looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. "Tired? You sit around this house all day doing nothing. Now get your purse, we're leaving in 5 minutes." I wanted to argue, to stand up for myself, but years of submission had worn me down. I got my purse and followed her out the door, hating myself for my weakness. When Tom came home that night, he was furious to find the house in disarray and no dinner ready. "What have you been doing all day?" he demanded. "This place is a mess, and where's my dinner?" I tried to explain about Martha's demands, but he wouldn't hear it. I went to bed that night feeling worthless, wondering how my life had come to this. Little did I know, things were about to take an even more dramatic turn. As the years passed, my life became a suffocating routine of servitude. Tom and Martha, his mother, seemed to take pleasure in belittling me at every turn. I was nothing more than their personal maid, cook, and punching bag for their frustrations. "Janet, these dishes aren't clean enough," Tom would bark, inspecting a plate with exaggerated disgust. "Do them again. And this time, try to be less useless." Martha was no better. She'd sweep into our house unannounced, her critical eyes taking in every imperfection. "Oh dear," she'd say with a dramatic sigh. "I don't know how my Tommy puts up with such a slovenly home. You really should try harder, Janet. A good wife would." Their words cut deep, chipping away at my self-esteem day by day. I felt worthless, trapped in a life I didn't recognize. The worst part was, I was too ashamed to tell anyone. When Jake would call from college, I'd put on a cheery voice. It was easier to pretend when Jake came to visit. Tom would transform into a different person, attentive, kind, even loving. It was like watching a skilled actor take the stage, and it left me feeling more confused and alone than ever. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Hello?" I said hesitantly. "Janet? Is that you?" The voice on the other end was older, rougher, but unmistakable. My father. My heart raced. I hadn't spoken to him in years. "Dad?" I whispered, glancing around as if Tom might appear at any moment. "Janet, I need to tell you something. It's your mother. She's very ill. The doctors, they're not optimistic." I wanted to rush to her side immediately, but Tom's words echoed in my head. "Your parents don't exist anymore." "I'll try to come see her," I said, hating how weak I sounded. That night, I gathered my courage and approached Tom. "My father called today," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My mother is very sick. I'd like to visit her." Tom's face darkened. "Absolutely not. We've been over this, Janet. They're not part of our lives anymore." I retreated, tears stinging my eyes. That night, I cried myself to sleep, feeling more alone than ever. Despite my worry and guilt, I decided not to argue with Tom. I didn't go to see my mother. A year passed, filled with regret and anxiety. Then, another call came. "Janet," my father's voice was hollow this time. Your mother, she's dying. The doctors say it's a matter of days now. This time, I couldn't stay silent. I approached Tom again, desperation in my voice. Please, Tom. My mother is dying. I need to say goodbye. Tom glared at me, his jaw clenched. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke. Fine, he spat. One day. That's all you get. Relief washed over me, mixed with a sadness so deep it threatened to overwhelm me. I called Jake immediately. Jake, honey, I said when he answered, trying to keep my voice steady. Your grandmother is dying. I'm going to see her tomorrow. Will you come with me? There was only a moment's pause before Jake replied. Of course, Mom. I'll be there. The next morning, Jake and I drove to my parents' house. My heart was pounding as we walked in. The house smelled of disinfectant and sadness. My mother lay in a hospital bed in the living room, looking small and frail. When she saw me, her eyes lit up. Janet, she whispered. My baby girl. I rushed to her side, taking her hand in mine. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have come sooner. Can you ever forgive me? She smiled weakly. There's nothing to forgive, sweetheart. You're here now. We talked for hours. I introduced her to Jake, now a grown man she barely knew. We shared memories, laughed a little, and cried a lot. As the sun began to set, my mother's breathing became labored. I held her hand tightly, and she looked at me one last time. I love you, Janet, she said softly. And then she was gone, slipping away peacefully in my arms. The grief hit me like a physical blow. I cried until I had no tears left, Jake's comforting arm around my shoulders. When I finally looked up, I saw my father standing in the doorway, his face a mask of pain. I went to him, and we held each other, sharing our sorrow. In that moment, I realized how much he'd aged, how lost he looked, without my mother by his side. I'm staying for a few days, Dad, I said. To help with everything. He nodded gratefully, and I stepped away to call Tom. My hand shook as I dialed. I'm staying for a few days, I told him when he answered. For the funeral and to help Dad. Like hell you are, Tom growled. You get back here right now, Janet. I mean it. For the first time in our marriage, I stood my ground. No, Tom. I'm staying. I hung up before he could argue further. The day of the funeral arrived. As we stood around my mother's grave, my phone kept ringing. Tom's name flashed on the screen again and again. I ignored it, focusing on saying goodbye to my mother. Then, in the midst of the eulogy, I accidentally hit the speakerphone button. Tom's voice blared out, loud and angry. Janet, you better get your ass home right now, or I swear to God, I'll come and drag you back myself. You ungrateful, disobedient scum. Who do you think you are? The gathered mourners stared in shock. Jake's face was a mix of anger and disbelief. My father looked like he'd been slapped. Burning with shame, I fumbled with the phone, finally managing to turn it off. My face was scarlet as I looked around at the stunned faces of friends and family. After the shocking phone call, my father gently took my arm and led me away from the crowd. Jake followed close behind, his face a mix of concern and anger. Janet, my father said softly, his eyes searching mine. Does Tom always speak to you like that? I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, shame washing over me. For a moment, I considered lying, maintaining the facade I'd kept up for so long. But looking into my father's kind eyes, I couldn't do it anymore. Yes, I whispered, tears welling up. That's how he usually treats me. Jake's sharp intake of breath made me turn to him. Mom, he said, his voice cracking. I had no idea. I mean, sometimes things seemed off, but I never thought. I nodded, wiping away a tear. You're right, honey. I'm sorry I never told you. My father's face hardened. Janet, listen to me. There's something you need to know about Tom. When he worked for me years ago, I caught him stealing. Not just from the company, but from clients too. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. What? Dad nodded grimly. He was inflating prices after contracts were signed, adding fake services. He'd overcharge customers and pocket the difference. My mind reeled. All these years, Tom had painted himself as the victim, and I'd believed him. I'd cut off my own parents because of his lies. There's more, my father continued. I recently heard from a friend that Tom's current company is under investigation. They've already found discrepancies and violations. I'd bet my last dollar Tom's behind it all. The pieces were falling into place, years of manipulation and deceit becoming clear. I felt sick to my stomach. Just then, my phone rang again. Tom's name flashed on the screen. With shaking hands, I answered and put it on speaker. Janet, if you don't come home right now, we're through. You hear me? Divorced. Tom's voice was shrill with anger. My mother's birthday is tomorrow, and we're celebrating at our house. You better be here to organize everything and prepare the food. Don't you dare embarrass me. Before I could respond, my father leaned in, a wolfish grin spreading across his face. Don't worry, Tom. Janet will be there. And so will I. We've got a few things to discuss. Jake stepped forward, his jaw set. Count me in too, Mom. It's time we had a family meeting. The day after my mother's funeral, Dad, Jake, and I drove to my house. My stomach was in knots, but I felt stronger with them by my side. As we pulled up, I saw several cars parked outside. We walked in to find the living room full of people. Martha's friends were gathered around, chattering and laughing. Martha herself sat in the center like a queen holding court. When she spotted me, her face twisted into a scowl. Well, look who finally decided to show up, she sneered. You're late. My guests need to be served. Before I could respond, she snatched a rag from the table and threw it at me. Make yourself useful and wipe down the table. Now. I caught the rag reflexively, years of obedience kicking in. But then I heard my father's voice, low and dangerous. How dare you speak to my daughter that way, he growled, stepping forward. Martha laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Your daughter? Please. Janet is married now. We're her family, not you. Now get out of our house and stop ruining my birthday. My father's face reddened. Your house? I think you're mistaken, Martha. I own this house. I gave it to Janet as a wedding gift. And I'm telling you all to leave, now. The room fell silent. Martha's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Just then, Tom walked in, his face darkening as he took in the scene. Janet, he snarled. What's going on here? Take your father and get out. You're ruining Mother's party. Something snapped inside me. Years of pent-up frustration and anger came pouring out. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope. No, Tom, I said, my voice steady. You get out. Here are divorce papers. I don't want to see you or your mother ever again. This is my house, and I want you both to leave. Tom's face went pale, then red with rage. But before he could speak, I turned to the guests and told them I'd been treated like a servant in my own home, for years. Jake confirmed every word I said. The guests shifted uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. I saw looks of sympathy, shock, and in some cases, dawning understanding. Get out, I repeated, looking directly at Tom and Martha. All of you, please leave. To my surprise, Martha's friends started gathering their things. A few even muttered apologies as they hurried past. Tom and Martha stood frozen, disbelief etched on their faces. This isn't over, Tom hissed as he finally moved towards the door, practically dragging his mother with him. As the door closed behind them, a profound silence fell over the house. Then, slowly, I felt a smile spread across my face. For the first time in years, I felt free. In the weeks following the confrontation at my house, life became a whirlwind of legal meetings and paperwork. I'd barely had time to process everything when news broke about Tom's company. The audit had been completed, and the results were damning. Just as my father had suspected, Tom's fraudulent activities were exposed. The evidence was overwhelming, and Tom was convicted. The judge's words still ring in my ears: "You will no longer be permitted to hold any senior positions in any company." My divorce lawyer, a fierce woman named Sarah, encouraged me to seek compensation. "You've endured years of emotional abuse and humiliation," she said. "You deserve restitution." I was hesitant at first, but Jake and Dad urged me on. In the end, the court agreed. Between the criminal charges and the divorce settlement, Tom found himself buried in debt. It was a strange feeling, knowing the tables had turned so completely. With the divorce finalized and the legal battles behind me, I decided it was time for a fresh start. I sold the house, too many painful memories lingered there. Dad insisted I move in with him. But the biggest change came when Dad invited me to work with him. "It's time you learned the family business," he said one morning over coffee. "What do you say?" I was terrified at first. I'd been out of the workforce for so long, and Tom's voice in my head kept telling me I was useless. But Dad was patient and encouraging. He showed me the ropes, explained the intricacies of running the affordable housing business he'd built. To my surprise, I took to it like a duck to water. Years of managing a household translated well to project management. My empathy helped in dealing with clients and employees alike. Dad beamed with pride every time I successfully closed a deal or solved a tricky problem. 3 years flew by. Then, on a crisp autumn morning, my world shifted again. Dad passed away in his sleep, peaceful and painless. The grief was overwhelming, but this time I wasn't alone. I had Jake, I had friends, I had a life of my own. As we sorted through Dad's affairs, we discovered he'd left everything to me: the business, the house, all of it. I sat in his office, now mine, looking at the photos on the wall. Mom and Dad on their wedding day. Me as a little girl. Jake's graduation photo. And a new one, Dad and me at the ribbon cutting of our latest housing project. "You've made me so proud," he'd said that day. "You're going to do great things, Janet." Sitting there, I made a silent promise to him. I would continue his legacy, but more than that, I would build my own. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities I'd never dreamed of just a few years ago. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when the doorbell rang. I opened the door and felt my blood run cold. There stood Tom, older and a bit more weathered, but with that same manipulative glint in his eye. "Janet," he said, his voice sickly sweet. "I heard about your father. I'm so sorry for your loss." I stood frozen, my hand gripping the doorknob. Tom took my silence as an invitation and stepped closer. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he continued. "I know I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But I've changed. My mother passed away last year, and it made me realize what's truly important in life." He reached for my hand, but I pulled back instinctively. "We could be happy again, Janet," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "There's nothing standing in our way now. We could love each other again, like we used to." For a moment, I was transported back to the scared, submissive woman I used to be. Then, something bubbled up inside me, a laugh. It started small, but grew until I was doubled over, tears in my eyes. Tom's face contorted in confusion, then anger. "What's so funny?" he demanded. I straightened up, wiping my eyes. "You are, Tom. The fact that you think you can waltz back into my life after everything you've done. The fact that you haven't changed at all." His face darkened. "Now listen here, Janet." "No, you listen," I cut him off, my voice steady and strong. "Get out of my house. Forget my address. Forget I exist. Because if you ever show up here again, I'm calling the police." To drive my point home, I pulled out my phone and started dialing. Tom's eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't the meek Janet he remembered. I watched him storm off, muttering curses under his breath. As I closed the door, I let out a long, calming breath. The encounter left me shaken, but also strangely empowered. I had faced my biggest fear and sent it packing. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Mom, great news. Sarah's pregnant. You're going to be a grandmother." Joy surged through me, washing away the last remnants of my encounter with Tom. Jake got married 2 years ago, and his wife was a wonderful woman. I called Jake immediately, and we spent an hour excitedly discussing nursery colors and baby names. A few months later, Jake and Sarah moved back to town. "We want our child to grow up near family," Jake explained. I was overjoyed to have them close. Together, we threw ourselves into the family business. Jake's fresh ideas and Sarah's marketing expertise breathed new life into the company. We expanded our affordable housing projects, and soon, our homes were in high demand across the state. As I stood at the construction site of our newest development, watching the frames of future homes rise against the sky, I felt a sense of pride and contentment wash over me. My grandson, little Tommy, gurgled happily in my arms, reaching out to grab at my hard hat. "See that, Tommy?" I said softly. "That's your great-grandpa's legacy. And someday, it'll be yours too." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the construction site, I smiled to myself. This was more than just a business, it was a new chapter, a fresh start, not just for me, but for generations to come. And I was ready for whatever adventures lay ahead.